Alright, so now we're going to finish up our microeconomics lectures with an introduction to heterodox microeconomics. Okay? Why do we need to now introduce heterodox microeconomics? I discussed at the end of the week 4 lectures that there are significant problems with the way the neoclassicals derive the supply curve. Okay? And I'm just going to go over it once again. We have, if you're a neoclassical economist, right, in week 3 we went over our cost structures, right, which neoclassical economics assumes that every single business has the same exact cost structure, which is fairly ridiculous, honestly. It's absurd because obviously not every business has the same cost structure, right? Microsoft's cost structure does not look anything like a mom and pop bakery in Des Moines, Iowa. Okay, they're different. Okay, but neoclassical economics assumes they both have the same cost structure. So anyway, we mentioned there are significant problems. There's an internal inconsistency in neoclassical microeconomics. Okay, and it all goes back to our cost structure diagram. Now, if you remember from week 3, where the marginal cost curve intersects the average variable cost curve, we call that the shutdown point, right? Because anything below this, you would not be able to even pay your labor, your variable costs. So therefore, it makes sense to shut down below this point, okay? So, that portion of the marginal cost curve doesn't really exist. Since you will produce here, you start producing at the shutdown point, okay? This, we said, the marginal cost curve turns into the supply curve, okay? And so we saw that the marginal cost curve is the same thing as the, let's call it just the aggregate supply curve, but it's the market's supply, okay? So this is your supply curve. I just want to take 1 second to make sure you can see this. Okay, so this is our aggregate supply curve, which comes from the marginal cost curve, okay? Now, if this is your supply curve, then we have a demand curve thrown in, okay? And just like we did in week 2, right, you shift your supply and demand curves to come to an equilibrium, okay? A supply and demand analysis is at the very basis of the idea that the neoclassicals keep emphasizing. And the idea that the neoclassicals keep emphasizing is that capitalism has a self-adjusting mechanism, okay? In other words, as I said in our introductory lecture of week 1, neoclassicals believe that if the government doesn't get involved in capitalism, if the government stays out of the market, then supply and demand will adjust until you're at an equilibrium, until the market finds an equilibrium, okay? And the very definition of equilibrium is a steady position, right? So all you have to do if you want to have a successful capitalist economy, make sure that government stays out of the marketplace, and you have to let supply and demand find their equilibrium position, at which point you will have a stable economy, okay? So, why does this matter? This is what neoclassicals have said for the last 150, almost 50 years, about 145, okay? That's what neoclassicals have been saying. Well, in 1956 and again in 1960, a man named Piero Sraffa, S-R-A-F-F-A, he wrote a book called Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, which I'll get to in a second. But what he did was he basically showed there's no such thing, and I mentioned that this is a very technical mathematical argument as to why, which we really can't get into in this class, but he demonstrated that there's no such thing as the marginal product. Well, if there's no such thing as the marginal product, there's no such thing as the marginal cost curve. And if there's no such thing as the marginal cost curve, there's no such thing as the aggregate supply curve, at least the neoclassical supply curve, okay? The way the neoclassicals reach a supply curve is invalid, okay? Why? There's no marginal product. If there's no marginal product, then there is no marginal cost. If there's no marginal cost, there's no supply curve. If there's no supply curve, then that means there's no self-adjusting mechanism in capitalism. Okay? In other words, these two curves will never be able to shift to find an equilibrium because there is no such thing as the supply curve. Okay? So in other words, you basically just have a demand curve that's out there, but there's no supply to meet it. Okay? At least in the neoclassical framework. The demand curve has some issues, but more or less it's okay. Okay? We can accept a demand curve, but there's major problems with the supply curve. As a result, we need to come up with a non-neoclassical view of supply. We have to start talking about production. Okay? And that is where we come to heterodox economics. Heterodox economics has been analyzing production for the last 250 years. Okay? It's always remained sort of off to the side, but it's existed for a very, very long time. Okay? So some of the ideas I'm going to introduce you to today are from Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, post-Keynesians, things like that, okay? Basically what we're doing is, remember, Sraffa showed that this curve doesn't exist. So, what we need to do now, at least the neoclassical explanation for supply does not exist. Okay, the demand curve's okay, but the neoclassical analysis of production is simply unacceptable. So what we need to do now is we need to come up with another way of explaining how businesses determine what to produce, how much should they produce, etc., things like that. Answers to the Adam Smith problem, right? The economic problem. What to produce, who's going to produce it, who's going to get it, how are we going to produce it. Right? These are just simple questions every society has to ask themselves. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to present, in our final lecture, a heterodox theory of microeconomics. Okay? And this has existed for a very, very long time. If you like what you're hearing here with heterodox economics, you should know that some of the department members in the economics department here at St. Peter's are heterodox. In fact, all of us are. Okay? So, therefore, if you like this, you may want to think about getting a minor, maybe being a major in economics, because this is what we really teach. This is how the real world actually works. This is the economics of the real world, okay? I should also mention this, that heterodox microeconomics is not built on theory, okay? In other words, neoclassicals used what's called deduction. They said assume A, B, and C. The same way when we were doing perfect competition, we said, well, assume free entry and exit, assume a standardized product, assume no barriers to entry, and assume that everyone is a price taker. Okay, and then from there you can reach your conclusions. Heterodox economics is created in a completely other way. What heterodox economists do is they actually go out and ask businesses, how do you decide how much do you want to produce? How do you decide what your price should be? How do you decide how much you should allocate to advertising, et cetera, things like that. We actually talk to businesses and then come up with a theory, okay? So its methodology is also completely different from neoclassical orthodox microeconomics, okay? So, let's start now. The order of what we're going to go through is the handouts, right, that I've listed on the syllabi for you, and they're on Blackboard. First, we're going to do linear versus circular production. Then we're going to talk about cost structures, manufacturing versus agriculture. And then we're going to talk about market governance and pricing. Okay, so that's going to be the order, 1, 2, 3. I wanted to put them up on an overhead for you, but the room, no matter what, I have all the shades closed and everything, and when I turned the lights off, it was still too bright in here. It's a really bright, hot, sunny day that I'm recording this, so it was still too bright in here to see the overhead, which is why it's not on. And so what you'll have to do is just follow along with the handouts at home, okay? Wish it didn't have to be that way, but it's the only way it's going to work, okay? So the video camera wasn't picking up the overhead, okay? So, neoclassical economics, right, views production as linear, okay? They think production is a linear process. What do I mean by that? Very simply, if you think about the way we've been talking about making stuff, right? We've been talking about supply and cost curves and things like that. We've been talking about taking inputs such as labor and capital, right? Just take these inputs, put them through a production process, right? You take these inputs, labor, capital, and then next thing you know, you have output. Voila, right? That sort of makes production itself seem like a black box, right? Despite the fact that for the last 4 weeks we've been talking about production, right? We've been talking about cost curves and firms and monopoly and perfect competition. We haven't actually talked about making anything, right? The way you make a candy bar is very, very different from the way you make a car, right? We haven't talked about production at all. All we've said is, you take, your average variable costs and your average fixed costs, and if you're above your shutdown point, then you produce something. Well, okay, producing corn is much different from producing software, okay? So you can see neoclassicals view production as a linear process, right? Linear just meaning straightforward and constant, where you take A and B, you put them in a production process, and next thing you know, you have output, okay? Well, the real world doesn't work that way. In the real world, this marker's starting to run out of ink, so I'm going to have to see if you can pick up green. In the real world, the way production works is the name of Sraffa's book. Okay? The name of Piero Sraffa's book was The Production of Commodities, so the production of goods and services by means of commodities, things that have already been produced. Okay? What do we mean by that? In the real world, Let's see if the camera can pick that up. Oof, not really. Okay. Guess we're gonna have to go back to black. In the real world, you have a commodity. I don't know, let's say maybe a tire, right? And that tire then gets put on a car. But it also, a tire, well, let's call this rubber, okay? Rubber gets put on into a tire. But rubber can also be used to produce a raincoat. And you also have steel, right? The steel is used to produce the car, but it's also used to produce itself, right? The way you make steel is you have to melt the iron ore into a big vat, right, that melts it down, and then you form it and things like that. You have to use steel for that. So steel is used to make a car, but it's also used to make itself. So that's just a circle going back around to it. Meanwhile, I'm sure you need rubber in order to make steel, and you need steel to make rubber, okay, right? Because if you're at a production plant that makes steel, your hoses and valves are all rubber of some sort, and in order to make rubber, you need to have presses, okay? So, rubber makes steel, and steel makes rubber, okay? The point I'm getting at here is production can be very circular. Like Sraffa said, you need commodities in order to make commodities, which then in turn make other commodities, things like that. Production is a circular process. It's not just the simple neoclassical A plus B and you have output, right? Instead, that was raincoats. Then you have rubber that makes tires, and the steel and the tires come together to make a car, right? And once you have the car, well, now you need that in order to make rubber and steel, right? Because your workers have to get to work using a car, which therefore the car is used to make rubber and steel. And also you need to start shipping your rubber and tire places. So you have these inputs, rubber and steel, that go into making a tire and steel for a car, and in turn, that is used to make the very thing that made it. Okay? So the point being, production in the real world is not as simple as production in the real world is not as simple as the neoclassical black box, right? It's not just, oh, you get some labor, you get some capital, and, you know, voila, next thing you know, you have output. No. In the real world, production is not linear. Neoclassicals believe production is linear. In the real world, production is circular, okay? It's more or less an input-output table. This sector uses this much, and it goes over to here, which goes over to here, right? Production is very, very complicated. The US has an immense productive structure with tons of interlinkages, okay? So in the real world, production is circular. If you accept the fact that production is circular, then that gives rise to the concept of an economic surplus, okay? What is an economic surplus? In nearly all economies, okay, few exceptions throughout the history of time, But in nearly all economies, the amount that has been produced, okay, production itself, the level of output of production is greater than the needs necessary to replace it, okay? In other words, it says on your sheet, right? In nearly all economies, production is greater than the needs of the economy to reproduce itself. Meaning, we produce, say, 20 tons of steel, right? Well, in order to make 20 tons of steel once again, maybe it only requires 5 tons of steel, okay? So that means there's a surplus of 15 tons of steel that we can choose what to do with, okay? So in all economies, you need to reproduce it, right? That's what an economy is. It's how we provide for ourselves. So we need to reproduce the economy through time. However, the needs for doing that are usually very small in relation to the amount we have produced, okay? And the easiest example, if you're still having trouble with that point, is just think about a very, very simple economy out in the middle of Kansas, and we're living off corn, right? Maybe, let's say our corn harvest produced 100 bushels of corn, okay? Well, in order to feed ourselves for that day, and in order to produce 100 bushels of corn, we only need to take some, corn seed, what have you, plant it, and we'll get another 100 bushels. So maybe we only have to take 5 bushels out of the 100 we've grown in order to get that same amount of corn, plus feed ourselves, things like that. So that means we have a surplus of 95 bushels left over that we can choose whatever we want to do with. That is the concept of an economic surplus. And once you see that production is actually circular, then it's very easy to then get to the next conclusion, which is that all economies, the vast, vast majority of them, all produce an economic surplus, okay? So, what's done with the surplus determines the potential for growth of that economy, okay? In other words, we had our corn, right? If we decided to only plant 5 bushels and keep 95 for ourselves over there, maybe offer it up to the gods. It'll please the gods if we, offer them 95 bushels of corn. Then we're only going to be able to reproduce the level of output we were just at. On the other hand, if we don't offer up so much to the gods, right, or give it away, if we invest it, then maybe next time we'll be able to grow more corn. Okay? So that simple fact is what determines whether or not your economy can grow. Okay? What determines whether or not your economy will grow is how much of your surplus gets invested. Okay? So right here, we're back to the Adam Smith problem. Right? The Adam Smith, the economic problem. It's basically who gets the surplus, what do they do with the surplus, how is it distributed, where does the surplus originate, okay? And what does competition do to the surplus, okay? What follows from here is heterodox microeconomics. This portion is, what did I say? Yeah, it's from Karl Marx, okay? This is actually what Marx said. You've always heard that, he's a big communist, things like that. This is what Marx actually said in his books, okay? So, who gets the surplus, right? So we have this economy where workers go to work, they produce things, and when they're done making these things, they actually leave them there and then go home, and the guy who owns the company decides what to do with the products that someone else made. Okay? So, who gets the surplus? Well, in capitalism, capitalists get the surplus, right? The person who owns the business, keeps the surplus. There's only so much that he or she has to pay in order to reproduce the business the next day, and the rest is left over for them. Okay? So why does that person, why do capitalists get the surplus? Okay? And when I say capitalists get the surplus, right, capitalists versus workers, or capitalists and workers, okay? Workers don't get, unless it's a cooperative, workers don't get the surplus, right? You get your wage, and however much is left over at the business, that goes to the guy who owns the business, right? Sometimes they let you have a little bit around Christmas time. It's called a Christmas bonus. But for the most part, however much of the surplus is left over goes to the person who runs the company, whereas you get your hourly wage, right? You may be salaried, but you could break it out to an hourly wage, okay? So why do capitalists get the surplus? Well, that's the legal code, right? It's the law. The legal code is what allows the people who own a business to dictate what will be done with the product of one's labor, okay? So you go to work, you make all this stuff, okay? Maybe it's sold, you know? But you go to work, you make all this stuff, then you have to leave it there, right? If you take it with you, the police will come to your home, right? Let's say you make cars, and if you are making cars on a daily basis, if you decide to take 100 of those cars with you, you have stolen from the company. Why did you steal from the company? You made all this stuff. Well, it's the legal code. The law says you have to go to work, make stuff, and leave it there, okay? So who gets the surplus? The capitalists. Why? The legal code. How is the surplus distributed? Because the surplus is what determines the growth potential of the economy, we need to look really hard at how it gets distributed, okay? That's what we're ultimately concerned with. Because as a society, we would like to be able to grow our society. And if unfortunately we are not able to do that, right? If none of the surplus, or a very small percentage of the surplus, is invested, then our society will not grow, okay? So, therefore, how this surplus is distributed matters a lot, okay? Because whoever has the surplus gets to determine the future of society. If only a few people, if only a few individuals get the majority of the surplus, there's no reason to believe that it will be invested productively. Why? Because there's no real competition, right? If it's just me and 2 or 3 other people who are getting most of the surplus, well, if we all get together and decide there's no reason to invest it, right? Because there's no competition amongst us, let's just all be content to be really, really rich, then none of the surplus will be invested, which means the economy will not grow, okay? This is why inequality is such a major issue in our economy, and you're only starting to hear about it now. Heterodox economists have been talking about inequality for the last 200 years. Why? The higher the level of inequality, right? The richer the filthy rich get, or AKA the more the really, really, really rich, the 0.1%, come to possess the surplus, there's no incentive for them to invest it. And if they don't invest it, then the economy doesn't grow. If the economy doesn't grow, society stagnates, okay? So the fact right now that a very, very small number of people control a very large percentage of the surplus is the exact reason why our economy is still stagnating. It's 2014 currently, right? In 2008 we crashed. Why has it been 6 years of stagnation? We have a very, very high level of inequality, okay? I want to say one more thing on that point, but that's enough. On the other hand, if the surplus is controlled by a lot of different people, okay, if there are a significant number of people, right, millions, who control the surplus, then there will be competition over accumulating more shares of the surplus, which means it will be invested, right? If I have a surplus, if you have a surplus, someone else has a surplus, right? Millions of us have a small little percentage of the surplus. We would like to get more of it, right? MCM prime. I want to take my surplus and turn it into a bigger surplus. So therefore, how do I do it? I invest it, hoping that the end size of the surplus is bigger than what I started with, okay? When that happens, you'll have a lot of people investing, which means the economy can grow, okay? And society will not stagnate. So, where does the surplus come from? Just, as a reminder, this is Marx. Everyone says that he's this crazy big communist. He wrote that much on communism and about this much on capitalism, okay? He was actually a critic of capitalism who happened to be a socialist. But he didn't write all that much about socialism or communism. Again, the only book he really wrote on it was the Communist Manifesto, okay? I mean, and if these ideas sound crazy to you, or if these ideas don't sound that crazy to you, this is Marxism, okay? Which is a portion of heterodox economics. We're not going to focus solely on Marx, but it's a portion of heterodox microeconomics, okay? So, where does the surplus come from? Okay? So, we can define three different terms here. Where does the surplus come from? It comes from labor. Ultimately, the surplus originates from labor. There's three concepts we need to discuss: necessary labor time, and surplus labor time, and then surplus value, okay? In order for a worker to reproduce him or herself, right? In order to live from day to day, etc., to continue being a worker, there's only a certain amount of money he or she must be paid, right? You need enough to put food on the table, to pay your rent, to pay your bills, and maybe a little bit for entertainment, okay? If you have children, you typically get a raise, at which point they give you enough to cover your child, so they don't have a group of angry workers, okay? So, the amount of time a worker has to work in order to get the money necessary to pay their rent, to pay their bills, maybe cover their child's expenses, food, clothing, shelter. That was called the necessary labor time. Okay? It's the amount of time a worker has to work in order to reproduce him or herself. Okay? On the other hand, there's the actual working time, okay, which for most people is 9 hours, okay, usually from either 8 to 5 or 9 to 6, right? They give you an hour for lunch. At least they say they give you an hour for lunch. Most of the time it's frowned upon if you actually take an hour for lunch. But you more or less work 9 hours, okay? A lot of studies have been done on currently what the necessary labor time is, okay, for individuals, but just to simplify the exposition, we don't have to talk about these. If you're interested, feel free to email me, and I'll let you know where to go to find the recent surveys on necessary labor time. But to simplify it, Just imagine that you make $10 an hour, okay? And you get paid hourly. So in a day, you get paid $90, okay? So $90 is more than enough to cover your expenses for that day, right? The rent for that day, the food for that day, maybe a child expenses, things like that, okay? Just for that day. And then if you annualize it, it comes out to, if you annualize it, it'll come out to a salary. On the other hand, what is the value of your output? Okay? Let's say you make cars, right? So you produce 10 cars every hour, okay? Well, that means in 1 hour you're producing, what? Let's say a car is $30,000. In 1 hour you're producing $300,000, and in a day, whatever 300,000 times 9 is, that would be 2.7 million. So in 1 day, the value of your output is 2.7 million, but you're only being paid $90, okay? The difference is what Marx called surplus labor time, okay, or surplus value. And if this seems a little abstract, here's a very easy, realistic concept of how to identify it. I don't know if you remember this, but a few years ago, Chilean gold miners were stuck in the mine in Chile for, I think it was 89 days, something like that, a significant duration of time, okay? So if you think about Chilean gold miners, how much are Chilean gold miners paid? The answer is very little, right? 6 cents, 10 cents, 12 cents, right? Not very much, okay? How much, what is the value of the gold that they pull out of the ground? A lot, right? So what's the difference between the difference between the amount of value they create by pulling gold out of the ground and the amount the capitalist has to pay them? That is surplus value, okay? That's where the surplus comes from, okay? If you're making cars, in 1 day you make $2.7 million worth of cars, but you only get paid $90 for doing it. Why? Well, it's the legal code, right? The legal code says when you produce something, when you actually use your hands to make it, it doesn't actually belong to you. It belongs to the person who told you you're allowed to make it, okay? So that is where surplus value comes from. Surplus value is, Marx said this many times, Marx thought that surplus value was his most significant contribution to economics, and if you took the rest of his stuff away, surplus value could still stand on its own, okay? That's why he told workers they were being exploited. It wasn't because he was, you know, some crazy guy, the way he is portrayed now. He wasn't some crazy evil person. He basically said, look, and this is 1860s Britain, right? Think Charles Dickens, right? He was saying, look, what's the value of the stuff these people are producing in factories? A lot. How much are they being paid? Not a lot. What's the difference? That's surplus value. They're making it, but yet someone else gets to decide what to do with it. Why? The legal code. And he felt that that was worker exploitation. Basically, your labor is being exploited for the benefit of someone else. That's Karl Marx, right? No matter what anyone else tells you, if you open up his book, Das Kapital, Volume 1, that's the first thing that's the first 200 pages, okay? And he said many times that he felt that was the most important contribution he had made, okay? So he's not the whole Soviet Union, you know, evil person maybe that everyone thinks he, or at least the way he is portrayed to be, okay? So now that we know where the surplus value comes from, or where the surplus comes from, we need to talk about the process of competition and surplus value. Okay? Capitalism. it's a struggle for survival, right? Every day, a business wants to take over another business. You could go out of business at any time, okay? You have to survive. It's a competition, okay? So, economic units need to acquire power over their domains, right? Just think about the pizzeria on your block, wherever you live, or the local pizzeria. They don't like having other pizzerias in town. Why? Because you could go there. They want to be the only pizzeria in town. That way you have to go to them, and that gives them power over their environment. That's why businesses always want to buy one another, okay? Because it eliminates competition. If you own surplus value, right, possessing surplus value, it allows the owners to have power over your domain, right? Surplus, or surplus value, the surplus is what determines the growth potential of the economy. So, if you, and obviously controlling the growth potential of the economy gives you power. So if you want power, you need to acquire surplus value, because then you control the future of the economy, which obviously gives you power, okay? So, owning the surplus gives a capitalist an enhanced likelihood that he or she will be successful in the future. So there's an inherent need to acquire surplus value, right? You want to get your hands on as much surplus value as you can. How do you do that? There's many ways of doing that. First, you could decrease the amount of time needed for the necessary labor time, okay? In other words, instead of having to pay someone $90 an hour, say in America, right? Maybe you could find someone that you only have to pay $30 an hour, or $10 an hour, or maybe 5 cents an hour, which is why a lot of production in America picked up and moved to China, Southeast Asia. Now it's moving to Africa, okay? Why? Well, your iPhones, right? This is an Android, it's made in Korea, their wages are higher there, but your iPhones are made in China. You don't have to pay a Chinese worker anywhere near what you have to pay an American worker, okay? So, why are all these companies picking up and moving to Asia? The answer is they get to pay lower wages, which most people then think, oh, well, we need to blame the unions for having such high wages, okay? Turns out that unions are actually only 8 to 8.5% of the American labor force. The unions are gone. The unions have been busted. They really don't exist anymore outside of the teachers union and steel workers. And if teachers and unions, if teachers and steel workers are what's making lots and lots of companies move their jobs to Asia, I would ask you to tell me a more realistic story, okay? Apple did not move production from California to China because my cousin, who's a school teacher, was making $62,000 a year, right? Or whatever she makes, I don't know. But Apple does not care about the teachers union or steel workers, okay? The simple fact is, companies are moving because they get to pay workers lower wages in other countries, regardless of what the unions are doing here, okay? The simple fact is just, in America, we have a higher standard of living than less developed economies. We are a developed economy. Southeast Asia is a less developed economy, or economies. Therefore, they have lower wages, okay? It's not our fault for living in a developed country. Instead, another solution would simply be to not allow the companies to go over there, okay? Because again, it really doesn't have that much to do with the unions. I don't know what Apple would care about the teachers union for, okay? But one of the ways you increase your surplus value is you find people you have to pay less, right? You get, just in America, you can get migrant workers, right? You get illegal immigrants. Well, they're here illegally, so you can lowball them. You don't have to pay them minimum wage because they're not legal residents, okay? But that's one way to increase your surplus value. Still producing the same amount of stuff, but now the amount you have to pay your workers goes down, okay? That's why the South was so productive during the pre-Civil War era, okay? The South was the best at making cotton. They had the most surplus value, and believe it or not, at one point, Natchez, Mississippi was the second richest town in America, okay? I think it was behind Philadelphia, it might have been New York. This is pre-Civil War though. Why was Natchez, Mississippi so rich? Well, you had really productive workers making a whole ton of cotton, but you didn't have to pay them anything, right? Slavery, you didn't have to pay them at all. That's why the South had such huge amounts of surplus. Once Lincoln ended slavery, and now you had to pay your workers in the South, the surplus value all went away. And as the surplus value went away, it turned out, as the South had less surplus value, there's less surplus to invest, which means since there's nothing left to invest, your economy won't grow. And what happened? Ever since the Civil War, I mean, we've had, you know, Reconstruction, and then you had, who was it? LBJ's effort to modernize the South. I think it was LBJ. But for more or less, for 150 years, the South has stagnated, right? You just go down to Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia, wherever today, and it's a vastly different world that's vastly poorer than in the North. Why? Well, they went from a situation where workers were producing this much, the slaves were producing this much, but they didn't have to pay them anything. So there was a ton of surplus value, which allowed them to keep growing because it kept being reinvested, to now there's no more slaves. So what ends up happening is you have to pay your workers. The workers are still producing this amount of stuff, but you have to pay them, so this is your surplus value. There's nothing left to, there's no surplus, which means you can't invest a whole lot, which means your economy does not grow, and which means you have stagnated for 150 years, okay? So one way of getting more surplus value is finding workers that will need less surplus and necessary labor time, okay? And you see this all the time now, even around here in supermarkets, right? The self-checkout line. Or when you go to a movie theater, you can buy your tickets from a machine. And all the other various machines we have in our economy, right? When you go to a toll booth, now you have Easy Pass. There's no person who you actually have to pay to, right? Why? Because you have to pay a person money, right? Whereas a computer does not require any necessary labor time. It does not require anything to reproduce itself other than a constant flow of electricity, okay? Which is a lot less, it's a much smaller cost than my cost. You can also, the second way to produce more surplus value, increase the productivity of the worker, right? Give them a computer. Before, you used to have to actually add things up on pieces of paper, things like that. Now you can just do it in Excel in 2 seconds, right? Bam, there's a formula for it. Everything is modernized using computers, so the worker is much more productive. If the worker is much more productive, you still pay them the same amount of money, but the amount of stuff they can produce in an hour goes way up. So if that goes way up, now you get much more surplus value, okay? So you could pay them less to increase your surplus value, or make them more productive, and you get more surplus value. both have been going on in America since the 1970s, okay? The average real wage in this country has declined slightly since the 1970s, so our wages have gone down, but now we all work with computers, so our productivity has gone up, which is why there's so much surplus value in this country, okay? Every quarter it seems like profits are at an all-time high. Why are profits at an all-time high? Because surplus value is at an all-time high. Third, there's concentration of surplus value, okay? If you want to get your hands on surplus value, how do you do it? Well, you can pay people less and you can make them more productive, but the fastest way is just go buy another company, right? If you buy another company, then not only do you have your surplus value, you also have their surplus value, okay? So you can consolidate companies. We call those mergers and acquisitions, okay? That is probably the easiest way to get your hands on surplus value. Just go buy up another company. What does that do? Let's go back to our pizza analogy, right? If you're a pizzeria and you buy up all the other pizzerias on your block, not only do you have all of their surplus value, but you've eliminated your competition. That's quite good. You are now definitely going to be able to reproduce yourself, okay? So, is this conception of capitalism efficient, right? Your book, throughout the last 4 or 5 chapters, has constantly been telling you perfect competition is efficient, right? Markets are efficient. The self-adjusting mechanism is efficient. Well, there is no supply curve. We already have established that. So there is no self-adjusting mechanism. But is it efficient? Are we really doing as much as we possibly can with what we've got? I'll leave that up to you to debate. That's for your own thoughts, right? But based upon what our productive capabilities are, right? Based upon the amount of surplus value that's in our economy currently, are we doing as well as we possibly can? Okay? And that was more or less Marx's ultimate question. Okay? He said, look, an economy can be really, really, really productive. We have tons of workers everywhere who are capable of doing a lot of different things. Okay? But for some reason, we have an economic system that seems to just funnel all of this surplus to a few really rich people who then just keep hoarding it and collecting it. He said, is this efficient? To him, it didn't seem very efficient at all. It doesn't seem very efficient to me. I think we could be doing much better than we are right now without going communist or socialist, without having a revolution. We could reform capitalism currently, in my opinion. I believe we could reform it in many ways to make it much more efficient and to make it work for the vast majority of human beings who are currently not actually being treated as human beings, right? Not currently being treated all that well. I think we could make our economic system much more efficient, okay? But that's for you to think about. Okay? Okay, so now we're going to move on to cost structures, agriculture versus manufacturing, okay? I think this ties in fairly well to the surplus discussion, okay? But that is, just to wrap up the last lecture, right, or the last handout, basically neoclassicals see production as linear. And it's not actually linear in the real world. Production in the real world is circular, right? It goes around and around. Inputs are used as inputs make outputs, and then some of those outputs turn around and go make inputs, okay? Which means production is circular. That gave rise to the idea of an economic surplus, which has existed in nearly all economies. Where does this surplus come from? We saw it comes from the creation of surplus value. And then why do you want surplus value? Surplus value determines the growth potential of the economy. So it gives you power. People want to get their hands on surplus value. How do you get more of it? Well, you either make your workers more productive, you pay them less, or you start buying up surplus from other companies, right? You buy up companies so you can possess their surplus value, okay? That's Marxism. That's what he actually said. If it sounds crazy, then so be it. But I think if you look at the real world, people are always talking about moving production to China, lower wages, making workers more productive, computers, and buying other companies, mergers and acquisitions. So to me, Marx has a very good theory of microeconomics. He thinks that's the way it operates, and just based on the concept of surplus value. For me, I think it holds water. Okay? Now we're going to switch, and we're going to start talking about they're post-Keynesian, neo-Schumpeterian. We're going to start talking about technology. Okay? In this lesson, we're going to examine the different cost structures of manufacturing and agriculture, and we're going to look at whether specializing in one type of production versus the other will give you a better potential to develop, okay, and to retain your development. Okay? But essentially, if you think about this, neoclassical economics, did I once ever, in weeks 3, 4, and 5, did I ever mention the difference between manufacturing, producing computer software versus producing apples? Okay? No, because remember, every single person in neoclassical economics has the same cost structure. Every business has the same cost structure. So if you're a goat herder in Mongolia, this is just the example from one of the books this comes from. If you're a goat herder in Mongolia or you're Microsoft in Seattle, it's assumed you have the same cost structure, okay? And neoclassical economists more or less assume that it does not matter whether you are producing potato chips or computer chips, okay? Famously, one of George H.W. Bush's economic advisors said, it doesn't matter if we produce potato chips or computer chips so long as we are specialized in our comparative advantage, okay? Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that a software company will always be richer than a goat herder, okay? If you're a farmer, you will never be as rich as Bill Gates, okay? Why? Well, it turns out not every company has the same cost structure. So in order to figure out which cost structures are different from one another, we need to start analyzing it. And that brings us to technology, okay? So, where does and we have this is a little philosophical to start with, but if you follow along, it'll be very obvious at the end. So where does knowledge come from? Where does just the knowledge, right? The idea of how to do things. A man named Thorstein Veblen said it comes from idle curiosity. And he called it what? The instinct of workmanship. Okay? Basically, it's man's innate drive to improve things, right? You may have figured out how to knock the apple down from the tree, but you want to just make it more efficient, right? Why? Because you want to be able to do it easier, okay? So that is where man comes in. The two things that separate are human beings, man and a woman. It's where human beings are different from every other type of animal or species in the world, right, that's ever existed. We have opposable thumbs, which makes it really easy to make tools, but we also have consciousness, which is what allows us to design tools, okay? In other words, okay, I know that if I if I throw a rock up at a tree, I might hit the apple and it'll fall down. But I've thought to myself, right, I have consciousness, turns out if I shake the tree, not only is that apple going to fall, but all the other ones are going to fall, and it will definitely happen. Whereas throwing a rock, I might miss, okay? So you can plan out your future, whereas all other species act on instinct, okay? We're the only one that has the conscious ability to change our environment. So where does knowledge come from? Veblen said the instinct of workmanship. You have this instinct inside you, workmanship, where you want to make things better. Okay, you want to make production more efficient. So that's where knowledge comes from. What gives knowledge its value, though? Why is knowledge valuable? Okay? Capitalism. It's a search for stability. Okay? As much as we talk about competition, businesses want stability, because stability allows you to reproduce yourself. It means that your business will not go out of business if things are stable. Power gives you stability. Okay? The more powerful you are, the more surplus you control, the more stable your position is in competition, in capitalism. Okay? Market share brings power. Okay? The larger your market share, the more power you have. In other words, if people buy a lot of your product, you have a higher market share than someone who makes less sales. Okay? People are more dependent on Johnson & Johnson with Tylenol than they are on, a corner drugstore, right? Why? Johnson & Johnson controls the pharmaceutical market, so they have power. If they get power, they're stable, right? Johnson & Johnson, they're not going anywhere. They're a very stable company. They have a ton of power, so they will always be in business. Therefore, an enterprise, a business that sells things for which there is a large demand, will be able to get market share. Okay? Think about all the large companies. Microsoft, they sell things everyone needs, your computer to work. Nike, they sell shoes everyone wants, so they have power. Johnson & Johnson, they make a product, Tylenol, that cures everything from a headache to a backache to a cold to a sore throat to arthritis, etc., right? So therefore, a lot of people buy Tylenol, which means they have market share. Market share gives you power. Okay? So you want to create things that people are going to buy. Okay? That's what gives you market share. So what gives knowledge its value? Right? The creation of knowledge comes from just curiosity. How can I do this better? But why is that knowledge valuable? Well, the ability to combine elements of knowledge, okay, into various products that will have a large demand is inherently important. Okay? Let's just take my phone. Android figured out how to combine Wi-Fi, GPS, sound, right? A touch screen, email, the internet. They figured out how to combine all of it. Because frankly, everything on a smartphone was actually invented by the government. In fact, the smartphone was invented by the government. But that's a digression. The Android combined all of these things, okay? Why did they do it? Well, they did it because they knew that a lot of people, and Apple did it first, Apple did it first. They knew that people were going to buy a phone that could do all these different functions, right? So, if they knew there was going to be a lot of people who wanted to buy all these different functions, this phone with all these different functions, then they knew that they would be able to acquire power. So what did they need? They needed someone who knew how to set up internet, GPS, etc., whatever, on a phone. That knowledge had a lot of value. So the actual creation of the knowledge, let's figure out how to set up a GPS, that came from curiosity, right? How can we tell where we are on the Earth using satellites? That was just curiosity. But why was it valuable? Well, once the GPS existed, now a company said, well, it would be really valuable and we could sell a lot of these products if we were able to put together a GPS thing with navigation, right? And now everyone in the world uses GPS on their phones for directions, okay? So the ability, and this is an important point, the ability to combine elements of knowledge is incredibly important in capitalism. There's an inherent need to combine knowledge in capitalism. What that means is that the ability to create synergies, and I'll define synergies in 1 second, but the ability to create synergies is essential for success in capitalism. If you want to succeed in capitalism as a business, your business must be able to create synergies. What's a synergy? Let's see if I define it here for you. I think, yeah, it's the next one down, but a synergy is simply when two or more things function together to produce something not independently obtainable. Now I know that sounds really fancy and whatnot, okay? Water is a synergy. Water is when two or more things, it's two things, it's hydrogen and oxygen. It's when two things combine, hydrogen and oxygen, combine to produce a result, water, not independently obtainable, right? You can't have water with just hydrogen. You can't have water with just oxygen. You need oxygen and water. You need hydrogen and oxygen to combine to produce water, and that is the simplest, most important synergy in the universe, okay? At least as far as humans are concerned. This phone is a synergy. In order to make this phone, they needed to combine a touchscreen with GPS, with internet, with an amplifier that, you know, beams something up into outer space to the satellite, with a phone, with all the other things your own personal smartphones do, okay? They needed to combine all those different elements, the GPS, the touchscreen, the texting, the email. They needed to combine those using synergies into one thing. So your phone is a synergy, okay? It is something that exists, and it would not be able to exist without all of these different things working together, okay? If you took email away from your phone, it would not be a smartphone. If you took the touch screen away, it would not be a smartphone. So that is an example of a synergy. Okay? In other words, a synergy, it's simply a combination of knowledge that exists from idle curiosity. The knowledge of how to create a touchscreen. That's idle curiosity. But a synergy, it's when you combine knowledge into take two or more elements of knowledge, combine it into a new product. Why do you want to combine it into a new product? Because it means that that particular product, well, if you're able to combine those two elements into a new product, that you think is going to have a large demand for it, if a lot of people are going to want to buy it, that will give you market share. And if you have a market share, then you get power. And if you have power, you are stable, meaning you will survive the competition that is capitalism. Okay? So, synergies. Another way of thinking about synergies are innovations, right? You keep combining these different things. Who knows what the next, big smartphone revolution will be? But the ability to combine these synergies into different products is what leads to innovation. If you can stop and remember back probably 10 years, remember how silly phones were compared to what they are now, right? You even, sometimes if you're watching an old movie, they have the flip phone, the antenna that comes out, and it's, the size of a walkie-talkie, and all it is a phone, right? You can't check scores on it, or whatever. That's a huge innovation. The smartphone, the iPhone, and then the Android stuff was a monstrous innovation. How was it an innovation? Well, Samsung and Apple created synergies. Okay? So synergies occur. Okay? That means innovation occurs because there's a demand for revenue, for profits, for market share, power, and stability. Okay? Why do innovations occur? It's because, or why do synergies occur? Innovations occur because people take all these different elements of knowledge and combine them using synergies. Why do they do that? It's because they want to get a large market share. If you get a large market share, just meaning you make a lot of sales, if you have a large market share, then that means you get power. You get power, you're stable, and you'll stay in business. Okay? So, ironically, it's a little ironic. The search for stability, right? Within capitalism, the search for stability, right? You want to eliminate your competition so you can be stable. It's sort of ironic how capitalism works. The search for stability is what ultimately ends up creating innovation. And innovation, by definition, is change and instability. So it's sort of an irony, right? Businesses want to not have any competition. So what do? They want to get market share. So they figure out, what will a lot of people buy? Maybe this new innovation. So they use synergies to create smartphones and laptops and tablets and whatever, right? And Under Armour used new types of fiber to create better shirts, things like that. And the very innovation itself is change and instability. You don't know how people are going to react to new products. You think you do, but you're not certain. So the very desire for stability is what leads to instability. Sort of ironic. Okay? But now you can see why capitalism is such a dynamic, technologically advanced system as compared to traditional and command societies. Okay? In traditional and command economic systems, there's no inherent demand for synergies to occur. Whereas in capitalism, synergies are the driving force. Okay? In capitalism, there is a need to use synergies to create innovations. Okay? Whereas in traditional and command societies, there's no inherent desire to create synergies. Okay? That's why capitalism is so productive as compared to, let's say, that's why America post-1776 is much more productive, right, as an economic system than the Soviet Union or America pre-1776, right? Once capitalism took over, we really started producing a lot of different things, okay? So now, let's see how this affects different cost structures. Let's talk about cost structures in manufacturing and in agriculture. Okay? Agriculture is it doesn't lend itself well to creating synergies. Okay? Agriculture specifically, there's little room for synergies, right? Why? Well, how many different ways can you grow an orange, right? How many different ways are there to make a banana? You sort of just have to plant the tree, wait for it to grow, and there's your banana, you pick it, and then you go sell it. There's not a lot of room for the creation of synergies in agriculture. On the other hand, in manufacturing, there's all kinds of different ways to create synergies, right? There's always a new product that can be created by combining new elements of knowledge, right? You could take the amplifier out of this and stick it in a tablet and things like that. It's electronics. I'm not a big electronics person, right? But there's always ways you can combine different elements of knowledge in electronics, okay? Versus in agriculture, a banana is a banana, right? There's only so much you can do. You can't combine an orange and a banana and make it grow faster. You just can't do that. Whereas what you can do in, say, let's take phones, right? You can have the big walkie-talkie phone where you're like, hello, but it's just a phone. And then, you know what? Let's combine that with GPS. And let's combine it with internet. And let's combine it with its, all the other things this does. Next thing you know, you have a smartphone. And then they keep giving you different versions of smartphones because you can make new operating systems, right? The Apple operating system, even though it's more or less the same operating system over and over again, they're in like their 8th or 9th version of it now. Okay? Why? Because they can always tweak it just a little bit to make it brand new. Whereas with the banana, you can't really tweak a banana to make it brand new. I mean, a banana is a banana. Okay? So, agriculture does not have very much room for synergies. Manufacturing has a great potential for synergies. So it would seem that manufacturing and services are sectors that have an incredibly large growth potential, right? If you specialize in manufacturing, you have the potential to really grow. If you're able to create synergies, right, then you will become huge, right? Your company can grow a lot if you are a manufacturing company. If you're an agricultural company, there's not really that much room for you to grow. It's simply, okay, I'm making bananas, and the only way you can grow is you need to get more land, okay? Whereas a manufacturing company could be making the same stuff in a room, but you start off by making the first iPhone, then you make the second iPhone, then you make the third generation, then you make the iPod Nano, then you make, the iPod touchscreen. You can make all these different things. So if you specialize in manufacturing, you can grow a lot. Whereas if you specialize in agriculture, the only way to grow is simply to buy more and more land, okay? So manufacturing and services are sectors that have an incredibly large growth potential. So they can offer a lot of different innovations to a nature, while agriculture cannot do that, okay? Also, we need to talk about the income elasticity of demand. Okay? The income elasticity of demand. Basically, how much more stuff, how much more of that product will you buy when your income changes? If your income was to double, you would probably go out and buy a bunch more TVs. Okay? Or you would buy some more cars. Or if you were rich enough, you'd buy yourself a private airplane or a helicopter or things like that. You get the point. All things that need to be manufactured. On the other hand, you probably wouldn't go out and buy that much more agricultural goods. You wouldn't buy that much more food. Generally, people eat until they are full, right? And you can't really stuff more into you. You'll, have major problems at that point. So, as it turns out, the income elasticity of demand for manufacturing is also much better than it is for agriculture. Okay? Manufacturing can produce synergies and people will spend their money on it, whereas in agriculture, there's not really that many synergies you can create, and people are going to keep buying roughly the same amount of stuff every time, right? If your income doubled, you're not going to buy twice as many bananas. You're going to buy the same amount of bananas. But if your income doubled, you would probably buy double the amount of TVs you currently have, right? Maybe put one on every wall in every room. Okay? So, that is why agriculture has what's called decreasing returns. Okay? In agriculture, the best land is used first, and then lands of lesser quality are used. And since the lands of lesser quality are used, your productivity goes down. Okay? So, decreasing returns. At first, you use the best land, so it's really productive. Then you use less land of lesser quality, so you're not getting as high as a return. Then you use even worse land, not as high of a return. So you get decreasing returns. When you combine decreasing returns with the fact that agriculture has a low income elasticity of demand, simply meaning people don't buy more when their income changes, you can see that agriculture is a really bad industry to get into if you want to grow a lot, okay? Especially if you're a nation. If you are a nation that specializes in agricultural production, you're typically poor. Why? Well, it's expensive to produce all of your stuff, and people aren't going to buy all that much of it, okay? They'll buy what they need, but they're not going to buy in excess of it, okay? So just think about all the countries that are currently poor. Think of all the developing economies in the world. What do they all predominantly specialize in? Producing agriculture. They produce bananas or rice or tea or oranges or whatever. But you know what they don't do? Make this, okay? Uruguay does not manufacture iPhones or Androids. Ethiopia doesn't make this, okay? Sub-Saharan Africa specializes in agriculture and mining, okay? But you know what they don't do? They don't manufacture, okay? On the other hand, the cost structure of manufacturing gets to benefit from increasing returns. So not only does manufacturing have a high income elasticity of demand, meaning that when income goes up, more people buy that stuff, not only do they have high income elasticities of demand, but manufacturing also gets to benefit from increasing returns. I've mentioned this before. Think about CDs, right? It costs a lot to make the first unit, right? The first CD, it costs a lot. You have to pay the recording artist, or forget, people don't buy CDs anymore for music. Think about computer programs, software, right? It takes a lot to make the first CD of the computer software. But how much does it cost to make the next CD? Half a cent, if that. How much does it cost to make the next CD? Half a cent, next CD, half a cent, etc., right? So it gets cheaper and cheaper as you go. That's increasing returns. So, just think about it like this. In agriculture, as you produce more and more, your costs go up and people buy less and less. That means you're getting squeezed. You don't have a lot of profit or surplus. So you can't really grow. Whereas in manufacturing, as you produce more and more, people will buy it and your costs are going down because of increasing returns. So you have a whole lot of profit, surplus, and growth potential, okay? So, it's really, really important if you are a nation that wants to become rich, if you're a nation that wants to become developed, you need to specialize in manufacturing and not in agriculture, okay? Just think about every country that is developed. There's one common denominator amongst every developed country. They're all manufacturing countries. They all produce this stuff. The camera that I'm recording this on for you right now, okay? Those are the nations that have become rich. Okay? Nations that specialize in agriculture are typically poor. There's no room for growth. Nations that specialize in manufacturing are rich. There's plenty of room for growth. Okay? Also, just think about the regions in the U.S. that are rich versus the regions in the U.S. that are poor. I mentioned the South, very poor. What do they specialize in? Agriculture. Okay? The South specializes in agriculture, and some of the upper Western Plains states, okay, specialize in agriculture as well. They're quite poor. What are the rich regions of this country? The Northeast and the West Coast. What does the Northeast do? We manufacture. What does the West Coast do? They manufacture, okay? That's where all the rich people are. And why are they rich? It's not because we're inherently more productive, unfortunately. It actually turns out we were lucky enough to be born in an area that has an enormous manufacturing structure and capacity in this region. Same thing with the West Coast. Whereas people who were born in the South and some of the upper Midwestern states, they are simply unlucky enough to be born, and Oklahoma, right? They're unlucky enough to be born in places that are heavily, heavily reliant on agriculture. So, it's very obvious now, right? You can start seeing this. The theory of synergies and income elasticity of demand in action, right? You can start telling, okay, why is the Northeast and the West Coast rich? Why is the South poor? Well, the reason is because we specialize in manufacturing, they specialize in agriculture. We specialized in the ability to create synergies. They specialized in the ability to not be able to create synergies at all, okay? So that's the main difference between manufacturing and agriculture, and their different cost structures, right? In contrast to neoclassical economics, which says that every single firm has the same cost structure, turns out in agriculture there's decreasing returns, and in manufacturing there's increasing returns. So it's not as simple as saying, well, it doesn't matter if you're a goat herder or a software engineer, or it doesn't matter if you are it doesn't matter if you produce potato chips or computer chips. Well, that's what a neoclassical economist would say. It turns out it actually makes a great deal whether you specialize in computer chips or potato chips. If you decide to produce computer chips, you will benefit from a high income elasticity of demand and increasing returns in your cost structure. On the other hand, if you decide to specialize in potato chips, you will have decreasing returns and you'll have a low income elasticity of demand, which means you will not have a lot of potential for growth. Okay? I'm going to stop the lecture there and we'll take a break, and then when I come back, we'll talk about pricing. Okay? Basically how companies set their prices. Okay?